Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of China Now, a show dedicated to providing the world with an overview of today's China. Here, you'll learn about how China works, how China thinks, and how China views itself and the rest of the world. The first section of the show is China Current. On this segment, we'll have Kris from China breaking down some of the most trending stories happening in China at the moment for you. To introduce you to some of the most heated discussions on social issues happening in China right now. Today's edition of China Current will focus on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics STEM education in China and the strides that China is making as a country in that regard. And next, the second section, Threshold, will have Lisa explain to you some of the most cutting-edge technological innovations happening in China right now to give you a glimpse of what China has been up to in the field of science and technology as a rising global power. This edition of Threshold will have Lisa explain to you how China is tackling the issue of climate change. Without further ado, let's get started.
China Current is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started. Hi, welcome to China Currents. I'm Kris. The West, viewing China as a strategic rival, is uneasy about China's accomplishment and potential, especially in science and technology. One of the stats alarmist pundits frequently cite is the sheer number of STEM graduates China produces every year. The number is projected to be twice as many as those in the US by 2025. But a spike has less to do with any grand scheme of the government to groom talents than with the general expansion of higher education. From 1997 to 2022, over a quarter century, annual college enrollment in China has increased more than 10 times, from 1 million to 10.8 million. The rapid expansion of higher education has, well, in addition to many positive impacts, resulted in an oversupply of graduates and depreciation of economic value of education. Back in my parents' generation, college graduates, the cream of the crop, were in great demand because, one, Chinese economy was taking off, and two, after a decade of cultural revolution, college degrees were an economic scarcity. When I was in college before the financial crisis, the economy was roaring. Every self-respecting student with a decent IQ wanting to become an investment banker, go into advertising or FMCG or big tech firms. It followed the money. Okay, only dorks like me ended up in the media. But I still consider myself lucky. Well, as a bachelor, I got my degree from an okay-ish university overseas, and I entered the profession early, so now I can have more educated people with more advanced degrees working for me. Sorry guys, c'est la vie. You see, when the economy slows down or focuses on quality growth, so to speak, it couldn't buoy the labor market. Existing positions filled, few vacancies available, and cooperation structurally favors the incumbents. Now if you pay attention to the news, there are a lot of stories about master's or doctor's degree holders doing less sophisticated works for meager income, like selling sausages on the street. And overseas returnees, dubbed as sea turtles, who used to be a coveted human resource, are now rotting their parents' homes. Because corporate world just turns out to be much less pretty than they imagined. They thought if they could get ahead of their peers at school, they would work their way up outside school too. Essentially, young people have three choices. One, outcompete your colleagues and fight for leftovers, even if it means compromising labor rights. And two, go back to school, get another degree, and hope the market will get better, which is what almost half of the undergraduates chose to do last year. Or three, settle for mediocrity. Mediocrity. That word hurts so bad in a meritocratic society. Now this is interesting. Let me digress a bit. So both China and the US are ferociously meritocratic, but we seem to emphasize on different aspects of the word. For China, it's about merit, or ability building, and for America, it's about cracy, or the rule. Perhaps this is why meritocracy is defended in China as a commoner's hope, but it's attacked in the West as a means to entrench elite rule. The imperial examination of ancient China in its modern reincarnation and notoriously difficult Gaokao are often cited as good examples of Chinese meritocracy. Exams provide fair chances for all, regardless of their birth, to join the ruling class, to become Mandarin officials or investment bankers. And education has always played a vital role. 1,000 years ago, an emperor of Song dynasty who was posthumously titled Truthful wrote a poem to encourage students to learn. He said, "Nowhere else should you look, because golden mansions, exorbitant salaries, and beautiful women are all there in your books." I don't know if modern feminists take offense in those words, but what he said about education being a ticket to the high society was widely regarded as a time-tested truth in China. Almost all parents tell their children to swallow the bitterest pill at school, which is to study. Some other day, you will sit on top of the lowly men, those farmers, workers, grocers, builders, janitors, waiters, barbers, masseurs, pedicurists, and delivery drivers. If you don't want to end up like them, study hard. Recently, a video of a teenage student rebutting middle-aged professor went viral in China. The professor was telling students to study hard in order to make more money, enjoy more material success, and crossbreed with white girls to improve the Chinese genes. Yes, it literally said crossbreed. So the angry teenager said, "No, we don't study to get rich. We don't study to crossbreed with Americans. We study for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation." If you're familiar with Chinese officialese, you'd recognize that verbatim quote of the Chinese dream, which has been front and center of Chinese national strategy since 2012. Of course, the internet applauded his patriotic idealism and accused the professor of corrupting young minds. I mean, it's never wrong to praise an idealist, to disdain vulgar materialism, and to despise someone who has less noble ideas about success, to purge our educators of decadent influences, to feel like guardians of our nation's future, and to feel good thinking that you have strong moral fiber. But you could think such mentality is limited to that particular uncouth middle-aged man, you'd be lying to yourself. There's no denying that the professor was definitely a racist, a sexist, a bigot, but he was no hypocrite. If you detoxify his language, it basically meant the world is yours for the taking after you get to the top. And you get to pick and choose from the healthiest and best-looking human beings to procreate. Do you really think there's a world of difference between what he said and what the truthful emperor of Song or your parents been telling you? Study hard now, so you can sit on top of those losers later. It's always been like that. In a world where there isn't abundance for everyone, there is inequality. The first and foremost important thing in an unequal society is maintaining upward mobility, or to give people equal chances at economic success. It's not an American dream or the Chinese dream, but a universal dream. To us, every Joe and Jane, education is our coin token to that dream machine. What will happen if this very coin itself is losing purchasing power due to knowledge inflation? If we invest in educational degrees in the hope of converting them to high income, which through accumulation amounts to success, then it's a bit of a stretch to claim to be successful if you're overqualified or underpaid for your work. So the majority is losing out if we use the same old standard to measure success and failure. I fear if a society doesn't prepare its citizenry to take up other new dreams while the old ones crash, people's frustration and disillusionment will break the society. The Russian-American scientist Peter Turchin has a very neat theory for this exact situation. It's called elite overproduction. Basically, it's about the education system have produced way more potential elite wannabes than a society can absorb into its power structure. And those who are left out will cause social disturbances. In the US, job prospects for law, language, and gender study graduates used to be very bright. Now, not anymore. So from the ruling class points of view, the harder it is for them to realize dreams, the easier they'll become agitators and use their skills they've learned to instigate unrests. That's why we need to keep asking ourselves the question, what's the point of education? We'll have our answers, but chances are to become more material and self-centered as we age. People say that if you're not an idealist when you're young, you have no heart, but you're still an idealist when you grow old, you have no brain. The world just incentivizes conformity by manipulating our desires. So after a certain point in life, even the most eager idealists get battered and weary. We just stop believing in anything other than money, power, and the pursuit of status. Take a peek. Let me tell you another story, okay? In China, schools hold rallies in the last semester before a college entrance examination to motivate students to make the final dash. This young lady from a mountain village was chosen by her school to give a speech on the rally. She said in an agitated state that, "Don't despair. We were born weak, but we can live strong. Nobody's doomed to be nobody all his life. One day you'll thank yourself for getting up early to study every day, for the door may be dark, but the high score in the exam paper will shine bright." Her school published the video in hope to inspire, but it went viral and backfired. Thousands of negative remarks flooded the comment section. If you take away personal insults on her presentation style, which might be too feverish to some, more serious critics actually take issue with her central message about education being a life changer. They apparently used to have the same belief that education was their single ticket out of their small hometowns, that from the college they could climb their way up in big cities. But after the hope was let down by reality, they turned into cynics and questioned the assumed promise of meritocracy. Basically, from their point of view, they studied to win, but not everyone could be a winner, so if education couldn't help them win, why bother studying? Why spread a false belief? I don't agree with their conclusion, but clearly they're onto something. If we all accept education as the answer to justify social stratification and unequal distribution of resources, the more uniform our answer is, the less valid. So there's a pressing need to find new answers. I believe our education needs to be more pragmatic and more holistic at the same time. Being pragmatic not only means vocational training programs, teaching how to make a shirt. By the way, China is starting to catch up in this regard. Last year, Chinese students won 20 gold medals in the 63 competitions at World Skills, which is the Olympics of skills. Bricklaying, beauty therapy, carpentry, electronics, etc. But also greater emphasis on letting students understand the role of their skills relative to other value components, like who's your customer? Why they pay extra? Where does the money go? What can you do to pocket it? So that they become more conscious and adaptive participants in the socio-economic life. And the holistic part should aim at encouraging the search for meaning. Meaning helps us to overcome alienation, which reduces humans to mere containers of skills and exchange whatever content there is for a singular reward. A healthy society is where people with full autonomy and agency of their own take risks to explore the meaning of their lives in all directions and arrive at different gratification in diverse ways. My 5-year-old boy dreams to be a space shuttle pilot for hire or a taxi driver in the galaxy. I hope when he grows up he'll pursue his dream and never regret, no matter he ends up in the sky or on the road, for having had a dream in the first place. Then I would know the world will have become a kinder place for dreamers. With that, I thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you want to learn more about China or have any thoughts on the comments or on the show, please contact us at the email address below. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Kris. Hi, I'm Lisa, and this is Threshold in China, a segment that gives you a taste of the future before it actually happens. I'm going to talk about emerging technologies that have life-changing potential and assess their ability to influence our life in the near future. I don't know if you've seen this on TikTok or not, there's a video that says China launched an artificial sun in the sky. What happened? Well, China is indeed experimenting with artificial suns. Yes, that's plural. They're testing 2 different artificial sun prototypes and simultaneously participating in a multinational research program. Just to give you an idea on the scale of the artificial suns, the one in Hefei, its core component weighs 400 tons, and its facility covers an area of 3 square kilometers. That's roughly 420 football fields. The suns, however, are not intended to be launched into the sky. The so-called artificial sun is a new type of nuclear power plant. To be more specific, a controllable nuclear fusion facility. Nuclear fusion is hailed as the ultimate energy source. Unlike fossil fuel, which will someday eventually run out, not to mention its impact on climate change, this source of energy is practically unlimited. Just think about the sun that's in the sky. It's burning at 6,000 degrees Celsius on the surface and 50 million degrees Celsius at its core, and it stays that way forever. What if we can have a sun that provides endless energy? Well, let's think about it. The sun is using nuclear power, but how is it different from the conventional nuclear plants? Most of the nuclear plants rely on nuclear fission, whereas the sun generates its energy through nuclear fusion. Hence, why we call fusion reactors artificial sun. So, fusion and fission, what's the difference? The first thing to know is that atoms with the same number of protons and different number of neutrons are called isotopes. Fission takes place when large and somewhat unstable isotope is bombarded by high-speed particles, usually neutrons. These neutrons are accelerated and then slammed into the unstable isotope. This clash causes the isotope to fission, or to break down into smaller particles. They split the nucleus and break it down into smaller isotopes and produce a large amount of energy. These high-speed neutrons that are ejected become projectiles that initiate other fission reactions, so there's a chain reaction. This resulting energy heats water in nuclear reactors, and the steam of this water propels turbines, which ultimately produce electricity. To summarize, in nuclear fission, an atom splits into smaller particles. On the other hand, fusion takes place when two low-mass isotopes merge together. Typically, it's isotopes of hydrogen, which merge under conditions of extreme pressure and temperature to produce neutron and a helium isotope. This resulting fusion reaction produces several times the amount of energy produced by fission. Unlike uranium-235, which is a rare material, there is a lot of hydrogen isotopes in the ocean. For every 1 liter of seawater, hydrogen isotope extracted from that can produce the amount of energy equivalent to 300 liters of gasoline. It's also more environmentally friendly and safer as compared to fission. Fusion reactions produce almost no radioactive waste, and this reactor cannot sustain a chain reaction, so they can never melt down like fission reactors. It's all nice and simple in a theory, but to build artificial sun on Earth, there are two major challenges that scientists and engineers have to overcome. First, it's how to reach 100 million degrees Celsius, that's almost 6 times the temperature of Sun's inner core, to trigger this fusion reaction. The scientists decided to use a 34 megawatts microwave device, that's like saying turning on 68,000 microwaves oven at the same time. But the problem is the best heat-resistant material on Earth melts down at about 3,000 degrees. So where to put this giant ball of fire? Well, they created a powerful magnetic field to contain it. Because under the influence of extreme heat and pressure, gasoline hydrogen fuel becomes a plasma. That's a hot, electrically charged gas. In this donut-shaped vacuum chamber, otherwise known as Tokamak device, scientists built a cage or magnetic field to contain the plasma. Its charged particles can be shaped and controlled by massive magnetic coils placed around the vessel. They use this important property to confine the hot plasma away from the vessel wall. The coils in the Hefei facility can produce a magnetic field 70,000 times stronger than that of the Earth. To create such a huge magnetic field, it requires a current of over 12,000 amperes, thousands of times of what an air conditioner would need. And the wires bringing the current must operate on the minus 269 degrees. So let's remember that's right next to the 100 million degree plasma, and there's about 1 meter separating the two worlds of ice and fire. Now, on to problem number 2. Once the temperature reached 100 million degrees, how do you maintain it so that fusion works continuously like the sun? The issue here is that the current of 12,000 amperes runs through the Tokamak device. It generates an enormous amount of heat because of the electrical resistance of it and the material. And as we want the machine to run continuously, the heat may eventually melt the device. So the scientists managed this by using superconductive materials. Their electrical resistance is close to 0, and this made longer continuous fusion possible. And of course, a better cooling system also helps. As of December of 2021, China's experimental advanced superconducting Tokamak East has set the record of continuously operating for 1,056 seconds. I know that doesn't sound very much, but it's a major step to the future application of this device. The chief scientist, Dr. Peng Xianjue of the Chinese Academy of Engineering, is optimistic that it can start to provide electricity by 2028. It is actually quite an ambitious goal, but if they achieved it, then the artificial sun is probably only 50 years away from us. Now, how good is it according to the standards of this threshold rating? That is readiness, novelty, and potential impact, or rippleness. In the readiness category, it is a 2. Having the fusion last for 1,056 seconds is impressive, but it's still a long way to go before we can rely on it for our daily energy consumption. As to the novelty criteria, although the Tokamak design itself is not really new, it was initially conceived and built by Soviet scientists in 1958, bringing ideas from paper to reality and also constantly improving it and innovating, it is a 3. And finally, the ripples rating. I mean, just think about the possibility of having unlimited energy that's also environmentally friendly. It probably will be the biggest achievement in human history. It is a 5. So there we go, 2, 3, and 5. Just one step away from meeting the threshold of real-world influence. Let's just quickly compare with other sources of energy. Like we said before, unlike oil and gas, its fuel, seawater, is super abundant and low carbon. Unlike solar panels, it doesn't require expensive and highly polluting rare earth elements. Unlike hydropower that needs dams, it can practically be built anywhere. And it uses far less land for every unit of energy produced as compared to wind or solar farms. If it can be realized and scaled in an economical way, fusion power has the potential to bring about a radical industrial revolution. What do you think will happen when human has harnessed the power of the sun? As usual, we look forward to hearing your feedback and imagination.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Kris. Now, let's turn our eyes outside the studios. Here, you may hear many voices in and about China, entrepreneurs starting their businesses from scratch, or our African friends living in China, or it could be thinkers and scholars sharing their bright idea about China and the rest of the world. Let's keep rolling to see what's for today.
You mentioned this idea of non-aligned movement. Were it to be something similar to the one advocated by India, Yugoslavia, Indonesia before, or slightly different?
It's a really good question you raise about the non-aligned movement. Certainly the context in the 1950s at Bandung, for instance, when Zhou Enlai, Nehru and others met each other for the first time, and then the founding of the non-aligned movement in Belgrade in 1961, the context then was also impending military clash, nuclear clash between the United States and the Soviet Union. That was the main issue on the agenda and so on. But the situation was different. Globalization of the kind we see now was nowhere on the picture. Now countries are far more integrated with each other. We can see this, with the way inflation rates so quickly get imported into countries. Global inflation, within weeks, you get food price inflation impacting every country in the world. That's a mark of the kind of integration that we have now. So it's difficult to imagine a non-aligned movement of the 1950s and 60s just emerging today in the same way. You will remember that for decades at the G77, which is the UN bloc of the NAM, China was not a member of the G77, and the votes used to be plus C. Yes, it was G77 plus C, C for China. But now China seems much more interested in being a direct party at the table of some of these conversations. And I think that changes the nature of the non-aligned kind of posture considerably. If you have China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, for instance, in October, if Lula da Silva wins the election in Brazil, this is going to return Brazil back to multilateralism. Brazil departed from the multilateral project in 2016 with the downfall of the government of President Dilma. The return of Brazil to multilateralism, the return of India to multilateralism during the Ukraine crisis. I know very well that President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa is extremely keen in the revitalization of some kind of non-alignment for the African continent. All of this, I think, could change the equation. So we are at a situation now where if China and Russia and other big countries actually sit at the table, and if they are open to talking to European countries who are themselves struggling between this false certainty and the dilemmas, I think we could drive an interesting agenda. Do you feel, for instance, that in China there is an appetite for this kind of non-alignment?
I think this is a great idea. Let's discuss again this idea of non-alignment. The point is, indeed, there is something we need to put China, Russia, India, Brazil, and other major developing countries together. But which concept could be the most appropriate? One is, of course, non-alignment. And the other is whether I just see whether VJ's view on that. Should we just call non-Western world? Or will that be things with this Ukraine war, we can see very clearly with regard to sanctions on Russia, there are two clear-cut different attitudes against or for. So West and non-West. So whether we should call it a non-aligned movement or non-Western, what I call movement or whatever, what kind of term which will be very important, we should explore that. Yeah.
See, it's interesting. I sympathized with your statement about Asian wisdom, but we should also admit that Asian wisdom is sometimes lacking. When we look at the projects of unifying continents in Latin America, they have gone quite a ways towards at least ideological unity. They call it Patria Grande, the great homeland. They have concepts, of Bolivarianism and so on. In Africa, they have the concept of Pan-Africanism. This is a vital concept, which I know the African Union thinks about and considers. Asia actually has had a very unfortunate history. Our Pan-Asian history, in a way, was hijacked by Japanese imperialism of the 1930s and 40s. And we were never really able to recover Asianism as a continental view. The divides are so great. So I empathize and sympathize with your term Asian wisdom, but I worry that we are also, we have a big mountain to climb in terms of building trust across Asian countries, building a project of some sort of Asian unity. We are claiming a kind of globalization, a kind of internationalism. We are making a claim for humanity. They are basically stuck in a 19th century warlike, Congress of Vienna, Metternich, Henry Kissinger. This is an out of date form of thinking. This sort of Congress of Vienna, Metternich form of thinking, divide the world up, use military force, make people fear you and so on. I don't want that world. We can, if we want, we can call it Western, but I'm afraid it's not entirely only Western. As I said, we saw that in Asia in the 1930s and 40s. We don't want that. We don't want a return to militarism, war, intimidation. What is the sanctions regime but a form of economic warfare? We don't want all that. What we want is to make a claim to humanity. And I feel like the platform, whether it's BRICS, a new kind of G77, the UN General Assembly, whatever the platforms, and we should use all of them, whatever the platform, we speak from humanity. We don't speak from territory. And the reason I feel that's important is that I think it is about time we stop allowing Europeans and North Americans to claim the category humanity. For too long, they have spoken for abstract human. And I think we need to refuse that. And we need to lay claim to the concept of humanity and not only to the concept of our culture. They are actually more parochial than we are. They are much more parochial. They have a parochial understanding of power. But we have a humanist understanding of the capacity of people and nature. And I think that's why I would say, let's be bold. Let's be a little, let's be a little ambitious.
Yeah, I agree with your statement. The Western concept of humanism is much more parochial than at least the Chinese one, maybe also Indian one. Remember, in both Confucius classics, in the Bible, there is a phrase called "Don't do unto others what do you do unto others do unto you." But in the Chinese literature, this on the top of all the values, this is one of the top values. But in the Bible, it's way behind. So, in other words, the degree of importance and priority is different. That shows difference in terms of whether it's comprehensive, broader, or parochial.
I'm a enormous proponent of Asianism. In 1947, in Delhi, the government of Jawaharlal Nehru hosted an Asian Relations Conference in 1947. The principal issue of that conference was the independence for Indonesia, the support of Asian countries for the Indonesian people, fight against the return of the Dutch after the defeat of the Japanese in 1948. Asianism is a very compelling idea. And I think that what blocks Asianism today are a couple of things. The first thing is that the United States, and has come to believe this after the end of World War II, that it is the so-called security guarantee for some Asian countries. So the United States military presence around Asia is considerable and dangerous. I'm talking about the bases that run from Japan all the way down to the Straits of Malacca in Singapore. I mean, it's incredible that the United States is not a signatory to the international laws of the seas and yet uses that treaty to conduct so-called freedom of navigation exercises off the coastline, not only of China. I mean, China has it directly in the gun sights, but also Iran. You will remember that US warships, go and dance around the Persian Gulf, threatening the Iranian coastline. So one is the United States, which has utilized its military and economic power to divide Asia, to create blocks from the Manila Pact of 1954, I believe, the Baghdad Pact, and so on. The terrible violence in Indonesia in 1965, which overthrew the government of Sukarno, played an incredible role. That plus the war on Vietnam, these played an incredible role by the United States to divide Asia. That's one author. And we Asian countries need to think about our role in facilitating the US entry. The so-called border dispute could be easily resolved. China and Myanmar solved their border problems in the 1950s. Why has India and China, why have they not been able to solve this problem? Is it seriously territorial? Is it really about Aksai Chin, and is it really about Arunachal? Are these the real issues, or is there something underneath that? And I really feel like we should create some sort of intellectuals forum about the question of the divides between India and China, because this gap, this is a real gap. And I agree with you, economic trade is going to increase. That's inevitable. But these gaps remain. And I think this gap between India and China is, to my mind, one of the principal reasons for the lack of progress on Pan-Asian development. It's the principal reason. It's not to do with South Korea or Japan, or these are petty issues that are provoked by the influence of the United States. In India, we learnt as children about the Chinese travelers that came across the Himalayas. We learnt about Buddhism going to Bamiyan and then eventually into China. We learnt about Rabindranath Tagore and his role, his visits to China. And my grandfather was part of a medical brigade that came to China in the 1920s. We have lots of histories in common, but this gap has to be closed.
Yeah, it's a problem. China has solved the land border disputes with all countries except India and Bhutan. And for Bhutan, it's mainly because of India, because India has a tremendous influence over Bhutan. And between China and India, I agree with you. If we are both broad-minded, we can solve the issue really in a way, conducive to both countries. And yet, on my part, perhaps with slight Chinese bias, the main difficulty is with the Indian side. Mainly, I've been to India 4 times. One is the Indian military, which still has a very strong memory of the 1962 war. Yeah. And the other is India's media. There is always a very strong voice against China, always. Yeah. And then with India's political system, it's a Western style democracy or whatever you call it. So the media and military always have very strong influence. Now, the Chinese approach is first, as you mentioned, in the history of China and India over thousands of years, in most of the time, we are friends. This border conflict is really minor in the long history between the 2 countries. The other is let's adopt an approach, what we call the mutual understanding and mutual accommodation. So that's how China solved border disputes with all its neighboring countries, including with Russia. It's different because we have a system which you have a central government led by a Communist Party, which can really have a long vision and plan for the future. Then India's political system is much more full of, how should I say, changes, So it takes really statesmanship rather than politicians to make a decision. If both sides have statesmen, it can be resolved within months.
It's interesting that you mentioned the border between Russia and China, before that the Soviet Union and the PRC. That border dispute was settled only recently, and it was settled pretty quietly. That's what I find interesting. There was almost no fanfare. Well, the border dispute became secondary to the other things that linked China and Russia. The border dispute, in a sense, was not the principal dispute. Once it became clear that China and Russia needed to intensify trade relations, that they needed to have closer security ties, that, when the BRICS was falling apart, when Brazil, India, and South Africa began to move slightly away, all that was left was RNC. And it was a consequence of that made the border dispute irrelevant. In that sense, we need to understand that I think what is going to make the border dispute between India and China irrelevant is what you said earlier: increased trade, increased mutual understanding of benefits. The point you made about the media is a very important point. There is a lack of, I think, generosity about what's happening in different parts of the world. I'll tell you, it's a funny business. We are actually, if I was to look at the numbers, we looked at 2 trillion in military spending. One of our real problems is not just military power, it's information power. Look, China did something quite extraordinary. It basically abolished absolute poverty, something that the UN Secretary General, praised China for. And yet, that was not front page news around the world. That should have been front page news in every newspaper in South Africa, in Algeria, everywhere. No, the West immediately began to say the Chinese numbers are wrong. They are fudging the numbers and so on. So that became the story. Now look at the disadvantage we are at today. And I think that is one of the fundamental problems between a country like India and China, is that most countries in the world have to absorb information and, dare I say it, quote unquote, wisdom from parts of the world which have their own agenda. There is no question that say CNN or Reuters or the Associated Press, they are not going to write stories that suggest, the special bond between the Indian and Chinese people. They will write a story and it will be highly inflamed about a dispute that took place somewhere in some mountainous terrain where a few soldiers died. Let me tell you something that you may not be clear about, that more Indian soldiers die of frostbite up in the glaciers in the borderland region with Pakistan. Indian soldiers die of frostbite every year than die from any other reason. Frostbite is the principal killer. Where are the stories about that? I mean, I believe, frankly, and I don't know if you agree with me, but I think that there should be a limit to where you can militarize. If you're talking about the Himalayas, I don't want to put a human being sitting at a border post where they're losing their toes to defend some rocks. I think that that's extremely inhumane to have Indian soldiers and Pakistani soldiers up in the high Himalayas. Western media is not going to do a story that more Indian soldiers die of frostbite than die of any armed, conflict, because it doesn't suit their agenda. And we accept their media as the real media.
If the two sides can sit down and talk, I strongly believe there will be wisdom from the two sides. For instance, in China's discussion of land or sea border disputes with other countries, we even put forward this idea. Let's put aside territorial disputes, sovereignty disputes. Let's jointly develop this particular disputed region, and they share the profits. So there are all kinds of new ideas we can explore.
Welcome back to China Now. I hope you enjoyed the show today. Let China not be far away from you anymore. If you still want to know other things about China, you can contact us through the email below. Thanks for watching and see you same time next week.